Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. How's it going? This is the third video for Unit 8, and I will be dead honest with you. I have recorded this video 3 times, and the camera, or my phone, or YouTube, or a combination of those 3 things have barred me from making the video work. So let us hope that this works. Here we go. The overall theme of this if you will, is that conservatives and liberals clashed over many social issues: the power of the presidency and the federal government, and movements for greater individual rights. The period from 1945 to 1980 is a time of big conservative ideas, but also big liberal ideas as well, and we're going to see those ideas clashing with each other. So let's take a broad perspective for a moment. Conservatives and liberals clashed over many social issues. Generally speaking, conservative values are going to favor the 1950s, for instance, a period of time where we see a belief in strong America, a belief in conservative family values, this notion that we fought World War II for values that we believe in, and that those values are the ones worth fighting for in America. We like assent from the broad majority of Americans. We like people to agree with what we believe to be Central American values. Liberals would say that we're more interested in seeing individual rights protected, that an individual has the ability to disagree with that mainstream thinking and at the same time be able to pursue their own ideas. Moving on to the other areas, the powers of the presidency and the federal government. This is a big area of dispute. Conservatives would generally say that the power of the federal government should be kept smaller, following that Jeffersonian idea. The Republican Party in particular is going to say that the federal government has done far too much in the 20th century already. This is a century that has seen the New Deal, and also, if you want to go even earlier than that, some of the reforms under President Teddy Roosevelt and President Woodrow Wilson, and then the New Deal, and then big foreign spending under the Truman administration, like the Marshall Plan. And then we're finally going to get to the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s, and conservatives are going to say, hey, that's too much. The federal government should do little. The state governments, the local governments, those are the ones should be the most active in doing the overall governing on a day-to-day basis. Liberals, on the other hand, would say that a big, strong federal government might be the only thing powerful enough to do some of the things that are necessarily important. That, for instance, if we're going to end racism in the South, that having a strong federal government is required to overcome that sort of an effort, that can't be done on a state-by-state basis. Or if you want to go back to the period prior to this and talk about the New Deal, perhaps the Great Depression is an example of something too big to be confronted by individuals or by church charity or by state government, that we need the federal government in order to overpower such a strong influence, such a strong problem in that sense in our society. And the last one here, they're going to clash over the movements for greater individual rights, I beg your pardon. Liberals are generally going to argue that the individual should be free to do more. The conservatives are going to argue that the society and the society's values are more important, and we should keep in line with those. Let's look at some relative examples over time. Our first set of information here is really about the 1950s, which is kind of a conservative decade. It's the only decade in the period we're talking about between, say, 1930, 40, 50s, where we have Republican presidents dominant, right? Dwight Eisenhower is the president from 1952 to 1960, and Eisenhower is considered to be not the most conservative of Republicans. He's kind of a middle-of-the-road Republican, and so his departure from a lot of the democratic values and ideas is not that definitive. Eisenhower believes in a big government. He believes in a lot of spending. He just wants to spend it on different things. Whereas a Democrat might say, hey, let's spend money on federal welfare programs. Eisenhower would say, no, let's spend money on the military. Let's spend money on the buildup of an atomic stockpile of weapons. 1950s homogenous culture. We're talking here about a rather cookie-cutter society, a society of suburban houses, of prosperity, of a belief that America won World War II, and in doing so galvanized this great set of American values: strong American nationalism, work ethic, a belief in family, a belief in a good religious society. All of those things are what we would define in the 1950s as being strong American values. Now, if you disagree with those, the 1950s are going to be a time where you're seen as an outsider. So for instance, the Beats movement, which is at the bottom here. We look at the Beats and we see a group that disagrees with the assessment of America. The Beats don't think that America is the greatest creation, if you will, in the history of the world. They see American foreign policy in a critical way. They think that America has been neglectful of some of the people at home. The Beats, therefore, are going to live a different sort of life. You're going to see different behaviors that run against the consistent idea of what we expect an American to be. Now, looking at the differences over time, the Beats movement is significantly different from what we consider to be mainline conservative 1950s behavior, right? What are you supposed to do in the 1950s? You're supposed to, going down the line here, buy a suburban house, have a whole bunch of children, get yourself a car, drive to new places, buy a whole bunch of goods. That's the celebration of America. The Beats would say maybe there's not that much to celebrate. Moving into the 1960s, the big issue of debate in the 1960s is the role of the federal government and how big it should be. Liberals would argue that the federal government should be active, very active, in assuring certain equalities across the society. In our previous worksheet, and I'm going to flip back for a moment here if you'll allow me, in our previous worksheet we talked about Johnson's Great Society and some of the efforts taken to live up to the promises of the Reconstruction era. So for instance, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the 24th Amendment, which are intended to assure that the full language of the 14th and 15th Amendments are practiced. Now, the difficulty becomes that a conservative, and let's go with the South here, a Southern conservative is going to say, the federal government should not be engaged in doing things in my state if I don't want them to be there. There are certain powers withheld to the state governments, and those powers should be allowed to be exercised by the state governments. Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society would say the federal government is the only thing powerful enough to make racism go away in a broad-scale effort in the South. So we need a large federal government. Now, Johnson also expands the power of the federal government here to do more things. For instance, Medicaid and Medicare, health care for individuals who can't afford it, in essence. The Immigration Act of 1965, opening up America's borders. We've been a really closed country to immigration since the late 1920s. This opens America to individuals who did not have the opportunity to come here before. It really begins a huge immigration to America of people from Africa and Asia. Okay? Limitations on the Great Society. There's only so much bang for the buck, right? One of the problems for Lyndon Johnson is he's spending a lot of money on Vietnam. He's trying to limit communism there, and as a result of it, he's not getting the sort of cash and funding behind the Great Society that he wants. There's a lot of squabbling going on between liberal groups. There's significant resistance from conservatives who feel as though Johnson is kind of the end of the line. If you want to go Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, Lyndon Johnson. Basically, how much government do you want? How much big government are you willing to have? Do you want the federal government to basically be the only provider of health and welfare and education and jobs in the society? Is that going to come to the point that it is? So the conservative backlash is coming here. And as Johnson tries to press more in Vietnam and press more on the Great Society, he faces more conservative backlash from the Republican Party. In 1968, that conservative backlash shows up with Richard Nixon. Now, Nixon is remembered as being a president who really represents a new conservative moment, right? Go all the way back to the 1920s to really find a strong conservative Republican. What do we mean by that, Holiday? The federal government needs to do less. Okay? We need to sort of close down the amount of things that the federal government is going to do. Okay? We need to get back to a society that believes in certain fundamental American values. Now, Nixon's silent majority, he would tell you, believe in those values. Why can't you hear them? Because they're not street protesters. They're not the people outside at the 68 Democratic Convention. They're not on a campus burning down an ROTC building. They're not individuals who show up at a rally and burn their bra, or burn their draft card, or burn anything for that matter. What do they burn? Endless man hours, working hard at a gig. They go home, they sit down in front of a television, they look at the TV, and they say, that's not my country. That's not us. That's the silent majority. Quotes around that. Silent majority. And that's who helps Nixon to get elected in 1968. It's seen as a triumph of conservative idealism. Okay, one of the major things we should track here is that a lot of southern states, which used to be bankable voters for the Democratic Party, turn this time. They go against the Democratic Party in 1968. They had done that a little bit in 1964, and that's a direct reflection that the Democratic Party has sort of lost the South. The Democrats for a long time considered to be the Dixiecrats, the power of the South, but Southern whites, upset over the issues of civil rights, have abandoned the Democratic Party and have now gone over to the Republican Party and the silent majority of Richard Nixon. Court cases. Here we're really talking about the rights of individuals and the expansion of those rights in order to assure that individuals have as much as they want. Miranda versus Arizona is a famous case. If you've never seen Cops, then you don't know Miranda. But if you've seen Cops, you've seen people being Mirandized, read their rights to assure that they know what their rights are. This whole vein of court cases here is an attempt to assure that individuals have rights and liberties. Now, Watergate versus California is kind of a different element. Here you have an individual who files suit claiming that he was barred entrance to the University of California Medical School based on the fact that he was a white, that he did not get in because his scores, although they were good, came from a white applicant. In other words, if they had come from a minority applicant, he would have gotten in. And it's a case about affirmative action. If you don't know what affirmative action is the effort to sort of redress social grievances and differences on race, to offer opportunity to individuals who in the past come from groups that weren't allowed these many opportunities. What the case declares is that basically schools cannot simply say, based on race, we're going to have a quota of this many people who are one group and this many people who are that group. But they can say that race is one of the factors of admission. Now, how you define how much of a factor, that becomes a stickier issue. The last thing on here is Watergate. And you might think, well, where does that fit in here? The limiting of the power of the presidency. Over the course of this unit, and going back to the last unit, the president's been getting powerful. Look at FDR and the New Deal and World War II. Look at Truman and the way we got into the Korean conflict. Look at Johnson and the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Congress wants to rein in the power of the president. They do that with the War Powers Act, which reins in the foreign policy powers of the president. But Watergate's a different element of that, right? Richard Nixon and the Republican Party are guilty of having broken into the Democratic Party's national headquarters to find campaign strategies, and then Nixon's guilt really comes with the conspiracy here, the attempt to get the government not to investigate the break-in, and then the attempt to cover up the break-in, and that is where Nixon gets himself into trouble. Now, Nixon's had some shady dealings in the past, but if you're a young person in America in the 1960s and 70s, and you believe the government is lying to you, and you believe there's a massive conspiracy, and the president is a crook, he is. Right? That's the sad part. All of those things were supposed to be kind of behind-the-scenes conspiracy maybes. Watergate kind of confirms, confirms that the president is doing some shady business. Nixon resigns, Ford comes in and replaces him, and then immediately pardons Nixon, which does nothing for the credibility of Gerald Ford. Have a nice day, folks.